Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're good. Hope you can hear me. I'm Jack Chew, and this is Tune It Over. And most days, weekdays, we come to you 12:30 till 1 o'clock to discuss whatever is topical in my world of MSK education and healthcare and where it intersects with culture. Now, one of my favorite guests on this show, more frequent flyers of a guest on this show, is my good friend, Ali Beverley, the LD physio. And one of the reasons that Ali, I think, is a regular on this show and one of my favorite people in this space is because his insight and expertise and specialism is one of which he's deep, but he's also, as a man and a thinker, someone that can apply that broadly and recognizes its intersection with a variety of different things and places. And especially because we've both got a passion for change, but also a passion for education as a means of change, rather than sort of, we're not battering around type policy wonks that then would wield or aspire to that style of power. Instead, we try to persuade and communicate and to educate. And so that's why I think we end up in a similar place, agreeing on many things, but also as a matter of style, even in areas where no doubt we disagree. I think that we come to a similar place in terms of how we end up navigating that. Now, one of the things that happened recently is that we ended up having a back and forth privately, and I watched him have it publicly, really, about the way in which people seem to think that as soon as you suggest something should be integrated within a syllabus, it could well be, as soon as you suggest something should be in a syllabus, they think you then assuming you could bolt it on or something has to go, rather than thinking, how can we mature and reform syllabus designed to integrate modern concepts and theories. And so I want to bring Ali in to discuss that in more detail, because I think it's a really fascinating one, and one that I see happen all the time. Like, there's a defensiveness that is sort of where ideas can really get killed, is because they just seem to be like, there's such a barrier because of supposed pragmatic factors. So anyway, enough from me. Hopefully Ali can hear me and I can bring him in a click. Ali, you got me?
I got you, mate. I got you. We're not muted like yesterday.
No, absolutely. Thanks for sorting me out there. Can you imagine, especially the nature of that rant yesterday, if I'd have just been wittering into the ether? So thank you for correcting me. Yeah, we're not muted. Hopefully, have I framed this chat well enough there? Do you want to give any more insights into what happened and why we're both fairly passionate about this topic at the moment?
Yeah, I think you framed it and concluded it quite well, actually. We can probably call it there, to be honest, if you want. Skip to the end. So it was essentially, so we've just taken a new cohort of students, third years on clinical placement from local university. And I think I understand that the fundamentals of, me being a learning disability specialist mean that I have specialist knowledge and skills that are an addition, are specialist by the nature of what we do.
Sure.
But I think when you look at the staggering challenges specifically that are faced by people with learning disabilities, and then you also look at the transferable skills associated with how supporting people with learning disabilities can transition into mainstream practice. The students, I just remember both of the students just going, we should know this stuff. Like, this is the fundamentals of communication. It's how to build a relationship. It's how to ice break with, build rapport, and they're not covered. So I, in my slightly flippant way, was straight onto social media. Put out there. I said, 2 new physio students today saying if we hadn't had this placement, we wouldn't have known any of this. And I think I just put out we couldn't do better in our undergraduate teachings. This garnered a fair amount of response, mostly supportive, and a few questions which were completely valid. But there was one from a educator or course leader, I'm not quite sure who. I just said, can you share what it was? And so I said, it was something to do with, it's almost everything related to practice for people who have learning disabilities, for looking at the scale of health inequality and practical steps to how to address that, how to engage people in clinic. And this was only on their first day. So I thought, oh, great, this is a great opportunity for me to engage somebody who maybe has some influence over undergraduate practice at a specific HEI, higher education institution. And then the response I got with that was it was exactly what we talked about, which was, well, it's really busy, and the time's hard, and we haven't got time for specialism essentially. And then the person completely disengaged from the conversation, because I think I came back with that just saying, I know it's very busy, but I said my concern is that many of the skills we're discussing are fundamental to clinical practice, rapport building trust relationships beyond 2 outpatient appointments. And then I said, although because it is specialist, it doesn't mean it shouldn't be taught to all to benefit students and every clinical interaction. To pass it off as we're busy, so there perhaps overlooks the harrowing health inequality for people with learning disabilities.
Yeah. Well, so, I think that speaks to, because that does. Sorry to interrupt, but that does speak to a big part of it, at least, if not the central piece, which is that if something's important enough and is accessible enough, which we can talk about how to make it such in terms of the knowledge accessible enough, then it's something that we need to find a way, right? We can't, there's no way that answer or same old or we do what we've always done. It's just not good enough. Or, well, it's always, we know it's good enough for the system, but it's never going to be an acceptable answer to you and I and our peers. So what I think is fascinating is you do seem, as far as I can tell in all of our interactions, you do recognize that you're not expecting the world to be as passionate about your hobby horse or aspire to the expertise that you have, right? And I think that that's one of the things that people want to accuse you of, people in mental health specialties, people with, I spoke to Jennifer James on Physio Matters recently, didn't know, where she's got her work, including her PhD and her expertise that she applies in clinic to obesity management. You know, that people sometimes do, just because some people do that, you know, it's like center of my universe should be the center of the universe. Yeah. But that you're at pains to explain that's not your point. But your key education pieces recently has been about how this stuff can be applied versions of the fundamentals. You teach the fundamentals well and you integrate that, especially on communication, then it doesn't necessarily, you use those as case studies within integral teaching, and then it's known, it's learned. Do you think that people misunderstanding that because it's just easier to know, or do you think that we're just not managing to cut through with that message that these things can be integrated? They're not bolt-ons.
I think, you know, I've sent some tweets out over the years around the undergraduate curriculum. I think one of them said, if you got 3 years in a blank canvas, what would you do? And that one went flipping nuts.
Right.
And it was fabulous, but it was interesting that there were all the specialists saying, well, my speciality should be on there. And I'm like, well, yeah, but you still have to get the fundamentals. And like you said, you know, I don't expect everyone to be as passionate as I am. That's absolutely fine. And I understand that. You know, the bulk of physiotherapy work is not within specialisms. You know, you and I have talked at length about the rise of the specialist generalist. And it's a card to which I hold when I engage with mainstream practice. And so I think that there has been, and I think there will always be, an eternal conversation around, you know, what constitutes a good undergraduate curriculum and core skills for physiotherapy. I know the CSP has just launched its common assessment framework, I don't know if that will influence that in any way, shape or form for clinical placements. Or maybe that's just about trying to get a handle on marking, probably the latter. But I think there's such pressure that it becomes a bit of a knee-jerk reaction when there's any suggestion that things need to change, or this notion that things can be added on to just, it's almost like, you know, it's almost a reflexive thing of, well, we're too busy. And I always think of the meme where it was people, cavemen pushing a cart with square wheels, and someone says, you know, sorry, we can't got time for that, we're far too busy.
Too busy circular wheels,
and I think there is that notion. I don't know if there's a bit of ownership. I get that the undergraduate universities are a competitive marketplace, and I think that's sometimes what we forget. But actually, what I would have thought that would foster innovation and desire for changes, and maybe some way to make your higher education place stand out. And it seems
quality and quantity come up, don't they? Right. So I think one of the things that me and you are always passionate about, quality and efficiency, and like, what can we do to get us bang for us buck? Where are our priorities? And what's the biggest fish to fry when it comes to learning stuff? And I think that's where you might find that people do have their own bias and their own take, and we can have a good debate about that. But I think where I've been frustrated is that on the quantity side, so like when it comes to like the capacity, like is the degree full, people are really twitchy about I understand when people are twitchy about what they don't want to remove anything, or there's some legacy that comes before it that needs to therefore, like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater type thing. We're just not cut from that cloth. Like, there's plenty of things that we would happily trim or contextualize, or what used to be a module could be a lecture, and therefore what used to be a lecture could be a module, because we're learning. We're learning about where to emphasize these things, and also what transcends the disciplines, like mine and your passion for rehab. You would think, because it's something that's such a unifier between our disciplines, but then also then in neuro and respiratory and stuff like that, it's like that's why we go on about sort of tailoring to people's function, communication skill, diversifying and understanding as to varying communication beyond verbal. These are all things that are essential. If you bake them into the center of it, then we wouldn't need to be so worried, would we, about exactly what else is on the options. But when it comes to quantity, I think that the excuse that has always been is that the degree is full. Right? This is a 4.5 days a week. You leave off Wednesday afternoons, as is the standard within enrichment, or whatever they still call it, with sports, etc. Apart from when you're on placement, and it's just brimmed. Now, some courses are. I accept that. Now, I don't think they should be. I don't think that means there's no room. I'm just yet to see the course of which that's all gold, in my opinion. But there's some that are doing 2.5, 3 day teaching, right? Yeah. And so then they're choosing, and that's their prerogative, right? They might still call it a full-time degree, but that's their prerogative. They're choosing to do that. And therefore, that is a different argument. There is capacity there. You're choosing that this self-directed, or for whatever resources, be that human resources through staffing or otherwise, we're deciding not to do it. So I've said a lot there, but like, that is a different point, isn't it? There is clearly space, and there's the different reason as to why you don't want to integrate this material.
Completely, and it's great that you brought that point up. Same, me bringing the point up, because we know that there are HEIs that are doing. There's a heavy bias on self-directed study. It's weighted more towards self-directed study than it is to actual clinical teaching hours. And like you say, it's in a competitive marketplace. They may have made their course efficient, but is that at the expense of quality? And I think if you're in a situation where I get that we're big gobs on social media, and again, we need to remember that social media is a microcosm. It is not. It is not physiotherapy as a profession, although there are a number of prominent physiotherapists on there. We are, a fraction of a percent of a percent of physiotherapists. And so, our views may not necessarily reflect the wider population. I think, such as look at the debate over the recent Physio Frontline magazine and whether that's delivering value for money.
Sure.
A lot of prominent people saying I didn't like it, but actually they seem to be almost like this, on social media terms, a silent majority who actually do engage with that. And I think, but if you've got people of a percent, and actually the bulk of that percent who have a voice and influence, such as yourself, are saying, look, we need to do fundamental changes and we can build our courses better, then what I'm wondering is, why aren't people engaging with that? Why aren't institutions going, oh, do you know what? Yeah, can we pick your brains on that? What, as clinicians working at the coalface, and I'm not saying that all people at universities who teach don't work, but I know a good proportion is biased towards academic and academia. If clinicians who are working and also involved in education are saying, look, these are the things that we need to look at, then why aren't we taking people up on the suggestions, or saying, can I get your information? Can you contact me? We'd love to chat this over, at another time. Just that seems that inherent resistance to change is still there and still prominent.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that I'm really sympathetic to, when people feel like, I'm aware that me and you as talking heads on the internet that aren't in the HEI with all of the pressures and challenges that they face, independent even of the pandemic related ones. Like, there's no lack of sympathy or empathy. We will extend that as much as we can. It's that when there needs to be a coherence or a respect for the point that comes from your defense, right? It's like, there's no doubt that you've not got a blank canvas, and that you've got the legacy and history of an institution, as well as your boss's boss that might stop you tinkering with that slide set. Of course, but that's not the defence that we often hear, is it? It's usually then something a bit deeper than that. Is that there's some special sauce that are baked into the existing plan that we're missing, and that the suggestion of what we're putting in its place is not strong enough. And that you don't get much engagement there, do you? It's not like you have much of a back and forth, and then you can kind of agree to disagree on the specific points. It ends up being a bit of a closed door. And on something as important and as serious as communication as a means of helping with health inequalities on a public health sense, the pandemic should only have heightened that. We should be more aware of what the circumstances are, right? The sociology of these things, and the way in which we now know that the areas in which we need to do better have been exposed by these tragedies. And therefore, to not course correct the education system just seems like that can't follow on. Like that needs to be, because that always has a lag, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So we need to get stuck into that. And I just don't understand why we can't be a bit braver on it. And I don't know, it's a bit harsh, but does it self-select for people that are interested in sort of somewhat more dated knowledge in a way? Because you've got, I think that could happen. It's sort of research can select for people that are hungry to find answers, but when it comes to sort of teaching and stuff, it does take you out of the rat race a little bit, and that you might not be as exposed.
It is interesting, and I remember speaking to a colleague a while ago, another physio actually in a separate country, who's been asked to do lots of virtual teaching, and they were that staff member said, "Look, if I'm going to teach on your curriculum, I need to understand what your curriculum's about and look at the fundamentals." And this person's a chronic pain specialist, and actually they looked into some even the MSc courses. And they were sort of saying, actually, what is being taught on those courses is like, I can't, it's scratching the surface of the fundamentals of what you need to get into for you looking at chronic pain management. And actually, so they were declining, hand over fist universities saying, please come and teach, because they didn't believe the fundamentals are there. So, my response to that for that person was to say, well, did they ask you what you'd want to change? And she was like, well, one have out of, I think, about 6. And I just don't understand.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because so in that instance, you're meaning that the prospective guest lecturer was asking to just see what would I be teaching, what foundations would I be teaching this onto? What is the known, what has been taught before, and because that would be completely a counter narrative.
Yep.
Then I mean that's and so interesting. Then that only one would invite that critique. I mean, what a brilliant opportunity to then sharpen that, and for it to then, for those that say that that's just a governance issue within the organizations, then you need to be more agile, and you need to campaign to be more agile, right? You need to stop those things getting baked in, or the legacy slide deck or style of practice, or maybe some dated knowledge amongst those that teach those particular foundational pieces. But when one of the things I worry about is that when we were learning our GCSEs or A levels or whatever, and you kind of soon afterwards, like as soon as you studied A level biology, you realised you were given half truths that were kind of necessary, just as a means of like you couldn't handle all of it, and then throughout your career you kind of get that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like like there's no way that the Krebs cycle that you learned at GCSE is in any way then comparable to if you then studied physiology now at M level. But it's just then, is that part of this that maybe that there is some, not falsehoods is wrong, but like half truths, or that we need to sort of teach it at such a basic level that then to look at it raw as long graduated clinicians, that you're just kind of like, well, it looks false, but it's actually like a half truth. I don't know if I'm making myself clear.
No, I think so, and I think there's a heavy structuralism bias, I think, in undergraduate teaching, both from my experience, although that was a decade ago, and through students that we currently get through. We're taking 6-7 sets of students from different universities on each year, and each of them, if they're not in their format with a heavy bias towards structuralism. And I think there is a requirement for anatomical knowledge and clinical reasoning, because as I think I've sort of given my definition of physiotherapy is we screen for red flags, and then we support people to have a better relationship with movement. So we have to have that fundamentals of what structures can be involved in biology to be able to screen. But after that, in our third year, I remember one of our lecturers sort of going, well, I taught my patients better. and maybe that wasn't the best turn of phrase for saying actually it's more complicated than that. But you know,
Sure.
I think there is a requirement for some things as a half truths, and maybe some of that is to be able. Maybe I don't know how it's being delivered. Obviously, I'm not there, but you know, is it being delivered? But this is electrotherapy. This is, you know, what some people think about it. Is it more of a make your own mind up, or is it, you know, given as was to me, you know, it's this will be, you know, this will cure everybody.
This is how this affects your pain gate. Yeah, I remember it well. I think it varies. I think that's one of the things that's hard, is I think there's an enormous amount of variation between these courses and between the faculty standards. And there's some real upsides to some of the newer schools that are coming through that can then, I did have a blank canvas of a sort. And then, but then there's also a downside to that in that they don't have the tried and tested methods and frameworks, and they certainly struggle even more than the existing legacy institutions for placements and stuff. So then that compromises their learning. So it swings and roundabouts a little bit. But I think that point you've made there is a really good one. And I wonder if we can try to draw in on those that are listening. Most people, of course, listen after the fact on these, and when we get stuck into the weeds, you know, you guys do hover until the last minute. We've had a comment come through from Luke Ford, but one of the things which I'll bring up, and we'll touch on Luke's point in a minute, definitely. What I want to ask for those that are tuning in live is, can we throw back to what Ali had said? Like, if you did have a blank canvas, what would you start with, or where would you put what would you make the fundamentals of, say, a physiotherapy degree, and how? You know, do you think that there is another question? If you take one or both of them, if you're listening, is what would you suggest that generalist degree of physiotherapy rather than, say, an MSK degree or a neurophysio degree? So do you think that has a history? Do you think that is the right unit? Like, should we delineate further? Much like some people said, do you study biology or do you study human biology? That sort of thing. Yeah. So I'm interested in your guys' thoughts, and I will bring you in on that, Ali. But first, can you reflect on Luke's point here about there being room in the timetable? He's on an MSc pre-reg at the moment full time, and there are gaps. Sorry, I can't pull it all up on screen. Gaps in the program with us only having that exposure to specialist knowledge on placement, which is a lottery, isn't it? So you must have experienced that, where this, you know, you only see what percentage of any, or what percentage of people even get exposed to, say, ALD work.
Exactly. And I think, you know, and I've had that argument, you know, thrown back at me, and I completely accept it. You know, when I'm talking about what specialist knowledge is, and people are like, well, that's kind of the point of going on placement, is you get exposed to things outside the mainstream. And I'm like, yes, completely. But that's going back to the bolt-on sort of mindset of, you know, how can we bolt these onto the curriculum? And we're not suggesting that. As I mentioned before, we're looking at these fundamentals around particularly communication, but it's certainly not, you know, applicable. It's certainly not a one thing. But these are things that should be interwoven in the fundamentals of every single healthcare professional. And again, we're talking about physiotherapy, but again, the fundamentals of communication, again, going back to it because it's my baby, are common to all interactions, and particularly within healthcare settings. And it's a shame that, you know, that people do have such an interesting variegated exposure. And if
Luke and others are saying there's room, you know, I'm living it now, and there's room for this, then it's amazing that that's not enough for people to speak up, because the answer clearly would be either, yeah, good point, let's do it, glad to hear you're keen, or, which is likely, is that they then say, purely for practical purposes, for buildings, staff, facility, money, make that case. It's not a good argument. And we need to start thinking about then, if we're admitting that for those practical reasons, we're undereducating the next generation of physiotherapists in this instance, but no doubt it then transcends that one discipline, that we need to be having that conversation, right? If that is the point that's being made. But instead, what happens is you just get some obfuscation and sort of half answers that can occur. Can I invite you on that same thing then? What would be baked into the foundations if you had if you could go from scratch?
If I could go from scratch, so I think you probably didn't guess what my first one was going to be, and that is communication. As I mentioned before, I think that fundamentally we have to have a knowledge of anatophys. There is an argument to say, do you need to take it to some of the levels? I remember learning about earwax in anatophys models. I get that that's something that may be relevant if you're working in a certain area, but how are we teaching that? And how that might affect it, and the mechanisms of earwax production. I specifically remember that lecture when somebody who's got a learning disability, for example, a 3% of the population have a life expectancy that's 20 years lower than everyone else. Where's the balance of thought process there in going, what makes good clinical undergraduate education? Yeah. So yeah, there's definitely needs to be the anatophys. But I think, I'm not coming in saying I'd love to be able to say, I could probably package it and sell it to say, I've got the perfect undergraduate course. Hell, I'd probably try and get funded and start a university myself. And that's not me. And much as it's easy for me to stand on the edge and be critical, I know my limits, and I'm not a full lecturer, but I think. But it's
also not what your frustration isn't that people might disagree with exactly what it looks like. It's that the conversation really struggles to get off the ground because people get prickly about implying that specialist knowledge, as it's either you find room for it to be bolted on, it gets found in placement. They see them as the two options rather than the obvious way to us is that if it's a strong enough case being made for its need, you integrate it within the core syllabus. And in these instances, these examples in case studies, it's disproportionate in really interesting ways that people don't realize. Like the fact that we know that a certain amount of your course, and it would transcend MSK neurorespiratories, you would work on understanding the, say, geriatric body and how physiology and anatomy might change with age. It's glossed over the fact that adults with learning disabilities, because of the health disparities that you've just mentioned in the life expectancy, means that they miss out on that. That's some level of understanding that we're taking through our degree that can't be applied. And therefore, it just ends up so skewed. And so identifying areas like that, mental health is another example of it, where it gets compartmentalized, doesn't it? It's like, we did mental health because we did dementia. It's like, well, I think that, from an MSK standpoint, with regards to the ways in which depression, anxiety, and other lower grade compared to, say, psychosis, schizophrenia, etc., can influence people's prognosis. People say, did you learn about that? So, well, I learned about yellow flags. And what did you learn about yellow flags? That they might affect poor results. It's like, wow, it's like it's just it's just to make a note of them or to account for it, almost like there's this list of excuses in case you don't get results or whatever. And done badly, of course, yellow flags and other identifiers can make people then think that affects the provision that they provide. So there's this accidental discrimination that's occurring over people thinking that's what that is for, is to sort of tell you what is or isn't appropriate for your efforts, which is not good. So that's where obviously a bit of a soapbox for me on that, because I do get irritated by the fact the conversation can't get going, never mind mature. But you're right to say we're not suggesting we've got all the answers, but we certainly are saying that this it needs to not be quite as sort of sacred and protected as it seems to be. There really is no room at the inn, as is the title, to be honest.
I certainly accept the point. Just before we do pull it to a close, the "you turned out all right" response, which was you and I, Jack, studied at a similar time at separate institutions, and we've come out with an understanding of these things. But what we're saying is actually, if you embed these at undergraduate level, you will have people coming out, where I was 5-6 years ago in terms of my understanding of these complexities. And so you can give people a leg up in clinical practice and skills, and therefore patient outcomes and the ergo public health, to be able to, by embedding these, and rather than, just going, well, you had a fairly, whatever course we had, and you're here talking about it now. Yeah, but we could have been talking about this 5 years ago and affecting change.
Yeah. When you know better, you can do better, though. I think that's always annoying, is that, you can throw back only so far, but there's definitely progress that can be made. And it's just, it's a very conservative position of all variants really to do that. I think I really appreciated the degree that I got. I think there's some ups and downs of it. It's a while ago, and there's naturally a change in that syllabus and that organisation. But also, there are things that I've riffed on this show before about how had I have had a more integrated functional anatomy understanding, then I wouldn't have found it so confrontational when I then needed to step. Like I didn't need it for a while, and then I went to learn to inject. I needed to sharpen it back up again. When I was sharpening it back up again, it was the rationale for things. It was just different. Like it could have been better, and therefore learn from a difference in that opinion. Similarly, it's just that the world is changing, right? Comorbidities are changing things, and therefore applying that into physiology needs to be relevant. And it's how often are these things mature, and it's so variable from institution to institution. I remember speaking to a lady at the CFP called Sally Goslin, who was in position, who ran this stuff initially. I don't know who's in her position now, but essentially, like where I was saying about how, in that case, I was making a point that the CSP hasn't found a degree it won't certify yet. And that therefore there's no quality, because the point she was raising was that, because I'm always questioning this word chartership as this novelty that we all pay money to be. And she was making the point, and it's a fair point, in that she was saying that it's got to be a chartered physiotherapy course for you to call yourself chartered. So the instead of it being, yes, postgraduate, it's integrated within your undergraduate. I said that only applies when you start to have chartered and non-chartered degree differentiation. Yet, is the CSP going to be brave enough to find its first syllabus it won't accredit and be able to defend that? I think that would almost be helpful. I mean, it'd be a shame on the school that didn't qualify for it for whatever reason, but at least they would be forced then, I imagine even legally, to justify as to why there is that differentiation. And then we start to have some way of aspiring to quality. Whereas at the moment, it seems so variable and there's no mechanism to raise those standards. So thanks as ever for raising it, mate. I just absolutely love it. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, I think we've covered everything really. I just think, one of the ironic things now is I'm just going to riff on is that, we talked about the fundamentals and the requirement to embed it as part of the undergraduate syllabus and not have it as a bolt-on. And then what we're going to announce now is essentially going to be a bolt-on. Is that one of the things that we are looking at is, if you've had a course or an education or even work placement that doesn't necessarily value these fundamentals, come to Liverpool on 12th February. Because although bolt-ons are better than nothing, we're not saying that bolt-ons aren't good. I lecture and do teaching as at universities in modules around specialisms. But if you can't integrate it, bolt it on. If you can't bolt it on, come to Liverpool and learn disability for MSK professionals, and you might see another straight talking northerner there in the show.
That's
Jack
right.
Chew.
I'm going to do a cameo, aren't I? I'm looking forward to that. I think that's one of the things that's different, as well as postgraduate CPD stuff. That inherently has to be a bit bolted on rather than integrated, because we are retrofitting it, aren't we? But if we can aspire to integrate it, then hopefully these things won't be required. But whilst they are required, come and see me and Ali in Liverpool, 12th of February. Really looking forward to that. It's going to be a really great. I think one of the things that I'm most excited about is that following your work, as I have done now for a few years, means that it's so applicable even beyond the specialism, right? So that's something that's a skill set worth acquiring anyway. But the way in which then it's higher order communication and functional rehab skill, because you have to be so creative in those fundamentals. Can you think of anything more important than communication and rehabilitation, right? I'm forever talking about that on this show. You will take away higher order skills of that, independent of whether you're going to then interact that frequently with those with learning disabilities. And so it's so accessible, and we're going to make it so. So I'm so excited to do a bit of a cameo workshop or whatever on that day. So we're going to work out the details on that. But thanks a lot, and please do get in touch with us if you're interested in coming along to that on the 12th of February. So we'll leave some details attached to this, and obviously create some clips from this show. So thanks a lot, mate. Really appreciate it. And remind people as ever as to where they can find you on socials.
So I'm on Twitter at the LD Physio and Insta _ the LD Physio _ because Insta.
I know. Why not? It sounds catchy. Right, thanks, mate. Speak soon.
Cheers.
Cheers, buddy. Thanks, everyone. Bye.